Thank you very much, Teepa Snow, for your generous time this morning with us, or this afternoon in America. Teepa, most of you know about, has a very positive approach to people with dementia, and she's going to talk about communication challenges, being curious, cautious, and courageous. And one thing just to say before you kick off, Teepa, is that our videos are recorded, so that if anyone doesn't want to be seen when they speak later on, to please mute your videos. But also, it's not medical advice, so if you do need medical advice, please see your doctor. Thanks, Teepa. Away with you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be with you. So what we decided to spend a little bit of time talking about is when people are living with dementia and they're trying to communicate with another person living with dementia, it creates fairly unique challenges that are different than when you're trying to talk with someone who lives without dementia, which has challenges in and of itself. So I wanted to title it Curious, Cautious, and Courageous, because the best thing I can say is be curious about the other rather than sitting in judgment on what is said or what is meant or making assumptions. Be cautious in how much or how often you choose to do something when it's not feeling right for you, but be courageous in being willing to take the risk, because it's only by doing what every one of you has chosen to do so far that we have changed from where we were 5 years ago to where things are now, and that is huge. I've been in the community called working with people who live with dementia for over 35 years professionally, and in the last 5 years I've seen the biggest shift in how we're thinking. Those who are in early adopters, not necessarily the rest of the world, but we've come a long way in a short period of time because people did start talking with each other instead of just fussing with one another. One of the things I'd say that I think is most critical when we're trying to work with each other is to be willing to get better. It's not like we're going to be perfect. We're never going to get necessarily great at all times. We'll have moments of greatness, but we can be better than we were if we're willing to let go of what's happened before and get in the moment where people are at that time. One of the realities is I may or may not remember the entire past as you remember it when I'm living with dementia. So if you're holding on to something that I don't even remember, that's going to get in our way of having a conversation at this point. I would also say one of the critical features is to learn to really be willing to go where the person is going at that time to see if you can get your head around what's the message underneath what's being said, because sometimes the words or the expression may confuse more than enlighten. So being willing to stay with that person a little bit longer and sort of figure out, okay, am I misunderstanding? Am I getting what they mean? Do I need a pause point here? Do I need to take a time out? But if you don't listen, you're not going to necessarily figure out anything, because you've got to be open to that ability and that possibility that they are simply trying to share something in a way that's uncomfortable. And you may be blocking that message because you're uncomfortable. We both care, so sometimes that gets in our way. The other thing I'd say is be willing to try something new. Even though it's uncomfortable, it might actually open a door or a window. So it may not be your preferred and it may not work all the time, but trying something new or learning something different might be a way to start out. And we're going to try some of that today. And finally, being able to actually see something from another person's perspective. And sometimes that's really hard, and it's harder than ever when flexibility is not what you have in that moment. And probably if that's the case, then be willing to say, whoa, time out, this isn't working right now. And the emphasis is on right now. It doesn't mean it won't ever work, but for you right now, you can tell it is not working, and better to pause in that moment rather than create more distress. So one of my big things is back it up, take a minute, and then let's try again when we're in a better place, each of us, because it could be one or the other or both are just in a bad place right now. And that's not going to get better by shoving and pushing at each other. As part of that, I think it's critical to be willing to say, I'm sorry. And it doesn't matter if you meant it to happen or not to happen. So I've come up with this idea of 5 ways to say I'm sorry. And it's simply an expression of what we were trying to do didn't work for me or for you, apparently, because we're moving into an uncomfortable place. We're moving into a place where we're not working with each other. We're talking at each other. We're struggling to hear each other. Excuse me. And so one of the phrases that I have has to do with intent. I'm sorry, I was trying to help. And it's pretty clear it didn't work. And that includes, I'm sorry, I was trying to help. I went too fast. I'm sorry, I was trying to help, which is real different than I'm sorry, I was trying to help. It's all an inflection in tone. And I find when I'm working with people who are living with dementia, my tone of voice and my inflection and my speed often goes up when I'm getting frustrated. And so does the other person's. So if my ears aren't tuned in to the shift of frequency, intensity, or volume, what happens is we're both missing out. Because I'm so busy trying to get a message out, I'm not listening to myself and how I sound delivering the message. I would also say that you can choose to say this differently, but when you're noticing the emotional impact of what you're saying, it's important to own, I just triggered something. I triggered it. I didn't intend to trigger it. I was trying to do something different, but it's pretty clear to me that I'm observing a reaction that looks like anger, frustration, sadness, a feeling of isolation. And what I see, I'll just say, I'm sorry. It looks like I made you feel really angry, and that was never what I intended. You're looking really mad. I'm not mad. Okay, I'm sorry. It looked like mad to me. Could you tell me more about it? Because if I don't say back what I noticed, I'm making an assumption that your appearance of whatever emotion it is, I start to take cues off that. And if I'm wrong, I need to own that. That's not right. I don't want to assume, I want to check it out. And the best thing to do is say, I'm sorry, it looks like I've made you really angry. And then it's your responsibility to say, yeah, you did, or no, you didn't. But that, I've put it out there because emotions get in the way of conversation when we're living with a disease that when you get emotional, your brain starts turning off. And the parts of you that allow you to interpret language, process information, are more vulnerable. And high emotional state reduces ability to process intellectual content. So we want to take a pause point then. The third I'm sorry, typically I find happens most frequently between people who do not have dementia, quote unquote. They're not diagnosed anyway as having a condition, or they're not viewed as having an issue, but what we're noticing is there's something going on there. And what happens is they're making the other person, they're saying things like, what did I say 5 seconds ago when we were talking? Now, I've already said that 3 times. And so in other words, the way I'm talking is giving the impression to the other person that I think you're less than I am. Your comprehending is not as good as my giving, and therefore you need help, and I'm better than you are. And if it comes across that way, then that desire to engage with another person is not there. It's just like, don't treat me like this. I am not an idiot. And that is one of those things that often people who get uncomfortable in emotional situations will start using language to make the other person be willing to listen, but that's not what's working. It's just making it unequal, and that's not all right in my book. That needs to be called for what it is. And so if I'm the one that's sensing that that's the case, I'm sorry, I had no right to do that. You're absolutely right. That is not something I have a right to do, and I apologize. That shouldn't be done. But I would also say on the other side is, you're making me feel like I'm stupid, is a statement that somebody has a right to say to someone if that's how it's feeling. Because if we're not going to be open in communication, and that's that courageous, you're making me feel stupid. And then pause. Now, that's when you're in control of yourself. The reality is, by that moment, you may not be as in control of yourself. And you might say, do you think I'm stupid? Now, that's a different kind of statement. But it's often one we might be interested in making when we're being made to feel as though we are. And certainly, having worked in the medical community for years and years, I'm quite familiar with that sense from physicians who will look at me and say, so what, you think you know a lot about dementia? And I'll say, well, I know a fair amount. I mean, I've done work in a variety of settings, and I've worked in head injury as well. And so then you play the game, and it's like, no, I'm not going to play the game. It's like, well, I know a fair amount. Tell me a little bit more of what you're talking about. And tell me more is one of those ways that you transition from that sort of constant state of distress to, well, let you talk a little bit. Let's see where it takes us. That curiosity. One of the ones that I find I use a fair amount, I'm sorry that happened. That wasn't my intent. It shouldn't have happened. What can we do to move away from there? And it could be the person says, I don't know. And I can say back, I don't know either, but I am sorry it happened. I want to see if we can figure out a way out of this. But you have to be sorry it happened. And if you're not sorry, it's going to show. So if you really don't care about what happened, then don't say you're sorry. If you do feel that you're sorry the relationship is damaged, you're sorry that we're not moving forward on something, then it's one of the statements I'll often make. I'm sorry that happened. It wasn't an intent. And then finally, I'll sometimes say, I'm sorry, this is really hard. I'm having a really hard time. And I don't know about you, but I know I am. And just owning, I'm having a hard time here. And you can do with it as you choose, but I want you to know that I'm working really hard, and this is hard for me. And it's simply a statement of openness. And once I've said it, you can use it for how you want to use it. But if we're going to move forward, I've got to be willing to say, uh-oh, a mistake. That's the way it is. We are going to make mistakes with each other because we're all doing the best we can with what we have. And sometimes what we have isn't what we wish we had, which could be emotional control, intellectual capacity, lots of energy, lots of ability to take in lots of data all at once, like we could at one point, whether it's fatigue or stress or distress. So when we talk about communicating, we know that we have 5 ways, and I like to use hands because they're a visual cueing of how you get stuff in. And one of the things I'd say is visual cues are incredibly vital in communication. Picking up on visual cues can be more challenging, but it's our primary way of getting data in. It's not so much the words as how you look when you say the words. And then when it comes to auditory, how you sound when you say the words. So with those 2 pieces, those are critical. And then we add the 3rd piece of physical positioning and physical actions when you're saying words. So, for instance, if I'm working with someone who has really difficult time processing words, I might want to actually pick up a coffee cup and go, would you like something to drink? Rather than simply, would you like something to drink? Because what's going to end up happening, I'm getting a message on the screen, I'm sorry, just trying, I guess, okay, yeah, all right. Sorry, it was distracting. Visual cues can also be distracting when they come up. So in that case, if I want to ask the question, I show the cue first, then offer the verbal information. So at a higher conversational session, I might say, so the notes that we were taking on the project, I had 2 questions that were coming up. Now all of a sudden I've set the stage for the next piece. So the first question had to do with, and these seem like really simple things to do, but it's amazing how frequently people are not able to give good cues and offer pauses so that the receiver of the message gets to acknowledge that they got it and they're ready to move on to the next step. So when one person is living with dementia, it's frequent that you want to get your message out. But it only works if the other person's ready to receive that information. And that means learning the art of the pause. And just as people who are trying to be supporters and partners are learning the art of giving a visual prior to delivering some verbal, we can all get better at it, but only if we're willing to work on it and acknowledge it. It's a skill. It's just like any other skill. Giving yourself that pause break and bringing some props along, recognizing I'm going to have a conversation. I want to talk about this and this, and bringing those items with you that are cueing for you and for the other person can really facilitate movement forward in a conversation or in an activity. So those are the 3. We have visual cues, auditory cues, and then movement cues. But the other 2 are smell cues and taste cues, which during most conversation, that's not so vital. When we get to actual intimate interactions with one another, it does matter because how you smell actually matters. Human beings are built in such a way that if you don't smell real good, it sort of precipitates a sense of, I don't like this. So for many people, wearing perfume is something that you really got to be tuned into, because although you may like the way you smell, it may not be for others. And so one of the very common things that we're starting to hear of more and more is the use of essential oils. And I'd say, oh, that's all well and good, but you better make sure the person you're going to be around, whoever you are, that other person feels the same way about those scents and those oils that you do. Because just because for most people lavender is a plus, there are some people for whom lavender causes headaches and causes distress. And so it's not an automatic. And people sort of get in their mind, well, that's what I use, so I would think it's good for everybody. And what I'd say is, it's a good idea to check it out before you have it available and have it present when you're going to have an interaction in person. What you do in your own house when we're having a webinar, that's one thing. But coming together into a meeting, into a group, then being aware of what you use for self-soothing, what you use that works for you, may actually be a trigger for someone else because they've lived a different life and have different issues. And so being sensitive to what works for you, whether it's what you smell or what you're tasting. So for instance, what you may be chewing or doing with your jaw. So some people like to chew gum, some people like to chew on ice, some people like to munch or crunch when they're in an activity that requires them to listen. And that makes sense because what you're doing is giving yourself deep pressure in the jaw so you can actually attend to what you're listening to. And for many people, that's helpful. The challenge is that when you're doing it, it can be distracting and distressing to the other person to hear this munching, crunching going on constantly, chips or pretzels or smacking of gum. So picking up on the other person, yeah, you might be able to do that, or I might need to be able to say, ooh, hey, Kate, I really hate to ask this, but is there any way you could not chew gum while we're working together? I find it really distracting, and I'm sorry. Is that possible, or is that a problem? And I gave Kate the option. Is it possible, or would it be a problem? Now, Kate gets to say yay or nay. But I acknowledge I have limits, and my limit is if I'm listening and watching you chew gum, I have to put that to the side, and it's causing me to have to use some brain power to let go of that piece so that I can focus in on your message. And as simple as that sounds, that gets to be more and more of a challenge, because these distractors make it harder and harder for me to stay focused on the words and the message, and the visuals and the movements and the other things are not matching what you're trying to tell me. And if you're looking a different way or taking notes while we're talking, it can look like you're not interested in what I'm saying, even though you are. Your cue is that you're not looking at me. And if that's a problem for me, I want to be able to say, so John, I noticed that you're taking a lot of notes. It's really hard for me to know whether you're getting what I'm saying if you don't give me a head nod every now and then. Would it be possible for you to nod your head when I'm asking something that sounds like a question when you're taking your notes? Thanks, that'll really help me. And so by letting John know what my need is, my desire, my preference, and then I may still have to prompt because it's a new activity for John, and John's taking notes because that's how he likes to get his data in. I may just go, John, yeah, is it working? Oh, yeah, okay, great. Okay, that's what I wanted to check. And now we've got a system of checking in, and John gets used to working with me, and he knows when he's taking notes, he needs to look up every now and then. And again, if he forgets, I can prompt without feeling like John's not listening, acknowledging John has a different way of taking in data than is my preference. And if I need it, I need it. My job is to ask for it and see what happens. But in a way that's, is that possible or not? Because I want to acknowledge he may need to really focus on note taking, and then I've got to make a decision. Can I handle this interaction? Can I take what I need from the interaction when John isn't doing the thing that I like people to do? And when is it getting to a place where it's starting to really bother me to a point where it's preventing me from having a good interaction? And that may be a time. John, let's pause a second. Can you give me some feedback on what you noticed I said so far? Now, the trick is I've got to wait long enough that John knows I'm serious and I'm not asking one of those quote unquote rhetorical questions where I really care what he's going to say. But I will tell you that if he's been taking notes, he now probably is going to have to look at the notes before he can answer my question. And that's not because he hasn't been paying attention. He has, but he has to take in the visual data, process the visual data, and then produce an auditory output. And if I rush him with, John, did you hear what I said? John, I asked you, John is going to be very tempted to say, could you shut up for a second so I can think? And if he's really, really well behaved, he won't. But if he's me, he probably will say, Teepa, you need to be quiet so I can come up with what you just asked me for. If he's in a good mood, and if he's in a pissy mood, he might say, would you shut up? If you want me to answer you, give me a second. That'd be a perfect time for me to say, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frustrate you, and I did. So if you're looking at your notes, do you have one or two things that you noticed that I said? Now, during that pause moment, what I made myself do is take a deep breath and breathe out, because I needed to let go of my frustration. Because if I don't let go of that, I don't care what John says, I'm not going to be processing what John says. I'm having a hard time letting go of how he said it. But the reason he said it the way he did is I overwhelmed him with content. And the reason that happened is he wasn't doing it fast enough for me. And it's one of our biggest challenges is that when each of us is in a different place with our cognitive skill set, time becomes this thing that is difficult to measure. We know when people's anxiety goes up, your sense of the passage of time is reduced. We also know that hippocampal areas and time awareness are struggling when people have many forms of dementia. And keeping up with time becomes this funny thing that a second seems like a minute, and yet a minute can seem like just a second has passed. And internally, when you're living with this, you don't have a really good clock to work with. So you could think you were just thinking for a second, and the other person feels like they've been sitting there forever, quote unquote, waiting for you to do something. And you really didn't feel it that way. So this is where we run into trouble, because we've got two different brains trying to get messages back and forth. So if we were to keep in mind, how do we give information? It's by showing, telling, possibly touching, what kind of sense or aromas are around, and what kind of things we're tasting. We give information that way when we have people taste things even. That's when you're in person. Getting information, you have to take it in through your eyes, through your ears, and through your sensory systems, whatever those might be. So think about the ideas of letting people see what you're going to talk about, whether it's through words or whether it's through emotion or whether it's through an object. Use a few words to see whether the showing and the telling are starting to come together. If you're present with the individual, then sometimes using a friendly touch to guide or direct the person to the object. So if we were talking about something, I might hold up. So I'm gonna take some notes. So let me get a pad. Okay, so you were talking about two things that you thought were important. Again, it gives you a clear message. I listened, and now I think it's important enough to take down information, but I also am getting you to tell me the information again because I didn't quite get everything that you said, I don't think. And rather than let it go on, I'm actually asking you to go over that again, and I'm going to use another system to help me take in that data and be able to make use of it, rather than just let it go on and go, I don't know what she's talking about anymore. I've gotten so lost in the conversation. Calling a timeout and going, whoa, I hate to ask this, but I think I need a recap. If you would, Kate, could you tell me, you were talking about, you know, we're going to work toward this proposal. And I know you said there were multiple steps we needed to do. Could you help me with what the steps were? I need to put them down because I lost where you were when you were talking about it. And I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to, but I got wrapped up in it. And I lost my place. But to continue to have the conversation when you're totally lost and go, okay, yeah, that sounds good. That's not really supporting anybody and moving forward in any positive direction. It just means I've given up. And that's not the goal. The goal is to stay engaged. And the way to do that is to give yourself permission to go, time out. I think I lost something here. And it could be me, it could be you. I don't know what happened, but I just lost something and I need some help. Are you willing to give it to me? And at that point, Kate also has responsibility, and I'm using Kate as an example just because she's on my screen and I can see her, and John's there. I can say, Kate has the right to say then, Teepa, I know you're needing more. I did it twice, and I'm sorry. I'm sort of reaching my limit, and I feel bad because I know that you're needing it. I don't think I can give it right now. And if we have a third person in the conversation, we could say, John, do you have anything that you could offer? Because I'm sort of stuck right now. Now, what that says to me and what I often encourage is rather than working in duos, consider working in trios. And the reason for a trio when possible is that actually 3 heads are better than just 2. Because when we have 2 people, we can pinch each other. But when we have 3, we can sort of figure things out and often work together. Sometimes it feels like it's 2 against 1, but it shouldn't. It should feel like it gives us more manipulative ability. Because where these, sometimes all 3 come together, sometimes these 2, sometimes these 2, sometimes these 2. But when we have that third party, sometimes that third party can be able to step back from a moment and say, it looks like both of you really are trying to get a point across. Kate, why don't you identify what's the one thing you want Teepa to hear first? And John, what's your thing you want her to hear? Teepa, tell me what you just heard the 2 of them say. So that we're sort of checking, are people getting and sharing and receiving and sending everything that people thought they were sending and receiving? Because it's easy to get off track here. Because when you're busy trying to take in data, when you're taking it in, if you're the kind of person who has to figure out where to put it, it's really hard to stay focused externally when you're now trying to figure out where to put that piece of data that you just got. And there's nothing wrong with that, it just makes it hard to stay in a conversation. And it's easy to sort of drift off and then to realize you've missed something. And to be a little embarrassed that you got sidetracked because you were trying so hard to pay attention, but you were paying attention. The intention you were paying is where to put the piece of data that you got, because if you don't put it somewhere, it's going to get lost. So that's also a job that you're doing. And it used to be easy, but now sometimes it isn't. Y'all who work around me and have been around and have heard, I really do believe how we approach each other really does matter. And that if we don't bother to make a friendly connection, then what we do after that is really not going to work very well. Because if I'm not paying attention to you as a human being, I'm not going to respect what comes out of your mouth. If I don't care about you as a person, then I don't see how what we're going to do together is going to really move us forward as a team. And so I'm a pretty firm believer in we need to pause and always sort of find those connections that we can make with one another and be willing to give those pause moments to ourselves so that we can acknowledge frustration, acceptance, not right now, because we can make assumptions or we can do assessments. And I'm of the mind that we want to be in the moment with somebody, because even though Kate usually is really sharp and really fast, in this group, actually, everybody knows she got back from Budapest relatively recently and has been through multiple time zones. So she may or may not be able to do what she usually does today. And it's just that moment. And giving grace is just that possibility, but not making an assumption that she can or she can't, but just checking in. How's it going? And do we have options? It doesn't take a lot, but it does take some curiosity. Saying it's Teepa is a lot nicer than, John, remember me? What's nice about, Zoom is it has your name right there. As long as you can still read script, you're good. But when you can't read the words and make the words match, and there's too many pictures and too many people, then having the person still say the name and attaching it to the face can be helpful. I'm from and you're from. These seem like really simple and easy things, but quite frankly, people cut to the chase way too often because we're coming in with our own agenda. and we don't always check in with the other person to make sure they're in the same place and feeling the same way that we are. Then looking at how we use our words, I really like thinking about things in this or that, either or. Which of these two things would you rather address first? We have a whole lot of agenda items. It sounds like two items that might be helpful would be this and this. Where are you with that? So I'm a firm believer in trying to provide options rather than ask yes/no questions. So do you want to talk about this or not? Sounds like we're already starting an argument. Versus, how are you feeling about having this conversation now, or would you rather put it on hold for right now? It has a very different flavor to it, a very different feel. Could we try something? I want us to try a different way of doing this. So, Kate, would you be willing to identify something that you've tried recently in a conversation with someone, another person who's living with dementia, when you were reaching a really stuck point? What's something you tried? Same old, or something different? So I'm giving a fairly long pause. Now I'm checking to see whether Kate realized I really wanted her to answer or whether I was still doing the presentation. So Kate, I'm pausing in my presentation and asking you personally if you've done anything different recently that you can recall, tried something different in a conversation that you noticed was different for you?
No.
No, same thing that you usually do? Same results you usually have, or did you have good results and no problems?
Same result.
Is that good or not?
It's okay.
It's okay. Good. So if it's okay, there's no need to try something different, eh? Yeah. Tell me how you knew it was a good result or the same result. What was the evidence you used to do that?
Both people felt okay.
How do you know that?
Both happy.
So you used a lot of visual expression, emotional expression in voice?
Yeah, tone, good tone.
Good tone. So looking at the tone of voice. How about enthusiasm? Energy level in the voice?
It's been good in Budapest.
Yeah, I bet. How about now that you're back home?
I'm barely awake, Teepa.
I know, exactly. And so what I'm picking up on is Kate's engaged, but barely. And that's not because she's not wanting to be engaged. She's still exhausted from everything she's done. And so noticing that, me continuing to push her at this point would be really stupid. It's not going to serve a purpose. And so I need to acknowledge that. If I miss those cues, Kate will keep trying for a while longer, but then it's just going to get frustrating for both of us. And so this is that place where when we are both living with this condition, it can really be hard to know when it is that we're still getting somewhere and when it is that we need to call a pause and a timeout, because one of us is in a place that it's not going that way anymore. And if we keep pushing one another, all that's going to happen is the wall gets thicker instead of the bridge gets built. And that idea of noticing, taking those pauses and noticing really makes the difference then. Because if you make a mistake now, then there's an emotional residue for the next time. And we go into the next interaction with a little bit of residue on us. And we're already feeling a certain way. And once we start feeling some way, then the brain starts reacting to those feelings. So rather than go through some of this other things, what I want to do is move to this place, and these are all here. This is simply there for later if you want to look at this stuff. Because the key message I would say is when we're working with each other, we need to be better detectives and quit sitting in judgment. We need to get real curious about each other. We want to figure out what's being communicated, not assume or presume, and don't discount just because of how the message got delivered. One of the reasons being, one of the realities when we're living with this condition, inside or outside and around, is that people often have some unmet needs. And depending on the extremity of those needs, what ends up happening, those needs trigger brains to behave in certain ways. And we have two major brains, our cortical, thoughtful, well-behaved brain, and our deep primitive brain that wants what it wants, and it needs it, and it wants to find pleasure and joy, and this interaction isn't giving me that, and it's getting to that place. Or I am having a lot of joy and pleasure, and I want the other person to have it too, so much that I'm ignoring where they're coming from. So physical unmet needs, and I always try to get things down to a 5 so I can hold my hand up and remember them, because I need visual cues and kinesthetic cues because I'm that kind of learner. Could the person, or could I, be hungry or thirsty and not recognize that in myself? Could I actually be having a glycemic issue? Could I be having too much sugar on board? Could I be really uncomfortable internally because I'm hungry or I'm thirsty? Or could I be tired or over-energized? Have I been at the desk way too long? Have I been having too many meetings, one after the other after the other? Or could I be exhausted from trying to process today because I didn't sleep last night because I was having visual images in my mind. I was being chased by people, or people were trying to do things, or I couldn't figure out where I was, or things are going on in there that can impact the next day or the next week. Could it be that I'm just emotionally tired? Not physically tired, but emotionally tired. Could it be that I need to void, I already did, and I'm now embarrassed about that because I lost control of it? Could it be that I need to go and have a bowel movement? Could I need to fart? Who knows what might be happening in my digestive system? Because, you know, frankly, I'm not keeping up with it like I should. I sort of forget to do things sometimes. I sometimes don't take care of things that I thought I took care of because my time sense and my passage sense may not be there. I may think I ate, and so I think that maybe what I'm feeling is I need to go to the bathroom. I can't pay attention to you because I'm trying to manage everything internally. When people are developing this condition, sometimes we're not tuned into the internal needs, and so I forgot to go to the bathroom. As simple as that. And once I go to the bathroom and I come back, I'm a different person. Anybody who's ever been in a car on a long trip, when Dad was in charge of the trip, will remember the time he was like, well, we're just going to try to make it to the next exit. It's like, no, let's stop at this exit. I'm reaching my limit. But it's not something we like to talk about, but these internal body things do happen. Temperature, too hot, too cold, comfortable, uncomfortable, or could you be in pain? And that pain thing is one of those things that sneaks up on people, and you don't realize how much you're hunched over, you're looking at the screen, you're in the same position. And then we have, of course, your emotional needs. Would you be angry about something, sad, lonely, scared, or even bored with this whole stupid thing? So I'm going to pause there because, believe it or not, we're at 45 minutes. And some of you may be saying, yeah, felt like 100. But the things I didn't talk about that maybe another time would be personality traits and how those impact. Because they do, and other pieces of the puzzle. Okay. And I'm going to pause there because now it's time for you guys to figure out what you might be interested in and ask questions.